All right. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to have the honor to introduce our first guest for the lecture series, Post-Soviet Identities, 30 Years After 1989, Marijeta Bozovic. Marijeta Bozovic is an assistant professor of Slavic languages and literatures, affiliated with the Film and Media Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. She's a specialist in 20th and 21st century Russian and East European literatures and cultures. And her fields of research include modernist and contemporary cultural studies, diasporas and transnational cultures, avant-garde politics and poetics, translation and remediation, Danube River and Black Sea studies, and digital humanities, new media, and cultural networks. Professor Bozovic is the author of Nabokov's Canon, From Onegin to Ada, published by Northwestern University Press in 2016, and of numerous essays on Nabokov and transnational culture, contemporary political poetry, and Russian cinema, among others. She's also the co-editor of Nabokov Upside Down, published by Northwestern University Press in 2017, and of Watersheds, Poetics and Politics of the Danube River, published by Academic Studies Press, also in 2016. She's associate editor of ASAP, the Journal of the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present, co-editor of the journal Russian Literature, co-curator of the Poetry After Language colloquy at Stanford University's Arcade Digital Salon, and a contemporary film and literature reviewer for Los Angeles Review of Books. Professor Bozovic's current book project, on which today's lecture is based, is entitled Avant-Garde Post, Radical Poetics After the Soviet Union, and focuses on contemporary Russian leftist poetry. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Prof. Bozovic at Brown today.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Fabrizio. Thank you to everybody who's helped bring me here and to the audience. I will say it is especially lovely and moving for me to be here and to be invited by Fabrizio, because he's one of the first people that I started working with when I came to Yale 6.5 years ago. He was still a graduate student at the time and said, "Oh, join my dissertation committee." And my response was, "Really? But I don't know anything." So it began there. I don't know if I know more now, but I remain as grateful for the intellectual friendship and collaborations that have followed. So I'll begin right away and say the topic of my work is what can politically engaged aesthetic productions from the former Soviet Union or Second World more broadly tell us about socialism today. As recently as 10, certainly 15 years ago, popular audiences and scholars alike might have answered this question primarily by invoking the dissidents who fled the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Throughout the 20th century, dissidents have provided popular and critical Western discourses with vivid tales of the treachery of leftist utopianism and the courage of individual resistance. But today, a vital strand of post-socialist leftism has surfaced once more across the former Second World. So here for the grim part of the talk, which is the former Second World has never needed Marxist critique more. As Stephen Crowley suggests, the central irony underlying contemporary Russian socioeconomic structures and their systematic study is that Russian society requires class-based analysis more than ever in the wake of its official discrediting. The rapid transfer of property into private hands that took place in Russia in the wake of disintegration remains virtually unrivaled even in Eastern Europe. And I quote Crowley, according to the World Bank, starting from a position of relative equality, Russia's increase in its Gini inequality index of 11 percentage points over a decade is close to a record. This concentration of property and wealth took place not during a period of economic growth, but one of dramatic decline, significantly worse than the US experience of the Great Depression. One study of Russian social mobility, comparing class origins with class destinations, found that from 1990 to 1998, downward mobility exceeded upward mobility by 30%, and that a downward shift, let alone of that magnitude, is highly unusual. By one estimate, the number of poor in Russia increased from 2.2 million in 1987-1988 to 66 million by 1993-1995. And a year after the 1998 economic crisis, 4 out of every 10 people slipped into poverty, unable to meet nutritional and other basic needs. Yet the taboo topic of socioeconomic class remains, for the most part, understudied by Russian social scientists and mainstream political rhetoric alike. With the exception of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, hardly a progressive group at this point, there have been no successful political parties challenging United Russia from the left of the spectrum. Excluding decidedly anti-Marxist studies of the stabilizing potential of a near-mythical Russian middle class, or research declaring Russian exceptionalism to observed global economic patterns, theory has lagged behind the horrors of lived experience. The notable exception has been the rise of politically and socially conscious themes in popular culture and other aesthetic productions. The intellectual work, then, of rebuilding class-based critique has emerged more prominently in the arts than in political theory, with a peak in 2012, perhaps the first recent peak, the long year of Russian and international protest. So I aim to explore one such artistic arena of social critique and to help magnify, amplify the voices of a new generation or generation and a half of Russian poets, bringing them to international critical attention. Alexander Skidan, I'm moving from top left to bottom right, Alexander Skidan, Dmitry Galinka, Katy Chukhrov, Kirill Medvedev, Romana Sminkin, Pavel Arseniev, and Galina Rimbu are my 7 case studies, not all of whom I will talk about in detail today. These poets, however, are frequent collaborators, linked by the way of the St. Petersburg-based journal Translit, several chapbook series, the Free Marxist Press, a number of poetry festivals, events, and actions in Russia and abroad. Moreover, they are united by their overt political engagement and explicitly Marxist orientation. Half the group are active members or leaders, de facto leaders, of the Russian Socialist Movement political party. They thus occupy a fraught position in post-socialist space and time. I aim to explore what I conceptualize as a contemporary avant-garde, hence the paradoxical use of prefixes in my title, which gestures at the temporal paradoxes of a revived futurism. In short, my thesis is that contemporary Russian poets seek in the legacies of the historical Russian avant-gardes of the 1910s and 1920s an undetonated alternative to both a neoliberal global present and to the still recent discredited institutionalized left of the Communist Party. I read the latest return of the Russian avant-garde as drawing on powerful local literary counter-traditions, reimagined through, reinvigorated by, and in solidarity with international theory and art practice. Or to rephrase, post-Soviet praxes take inspiration from and claim continuity with historical avant-gardes, dialectically influenced by international critical theory, and all of it stitched through with a common red thread. Through embodied poetic performances, and at protests that merge agilely with digital remediation and dissemination, as well as through the prodigious translation of poetry, critical theory, political philosophy from around the globe, the newest Russian avant-garde tries to create distinct counter networks of the local and transnational. I'll show an image from the Translit blog. Also, as an explicitly post-Soviet cultural formation, this constellation of sympathetic practices dares to move past the traumas of state socialism to reimagine politically engaged art for the 21st century in Russia. Tracing the recurrent pulse of the avant-garde as a strategy, suggests an alternative narrative of 20th century and contemporary Russian culture, and shifts the discussion of contemporary aesthetic productions from narratives of transition and catching up to the West to renewed experiment and dreams of futurity. And I'll show another quick image from the blogs. Through the study, translation, modification, and reappropriation of the still incendiary texts and strategies of, again, a combination of historical Russian avant-gardes, but also post-war European radicals of the 60s, as well as global contemporary artists, thinkers, and activists, these poets create agile models of translocal collectivities. Russian poetry merges with other forms, media, and languages through digital remediation, collective translation, and immediate dissemination via online platforms. Meanwhile, the effort itself to think leftward, beyond a state socialist past, to some kind of global egalitarian future, challenges both Russian and oppositional Western narratives in our increasingly interconnected world. So it's very important to me that I argue that this avant-garde return cannot be dismissed as mere Soviet nostalgia. In fact, the highly culturally aware appropriations and remediations at play here can more readily be seen as a reaction to mainstream and official nostalgia for such imperial and militant aestheticized politics of the Soviet Union. For example, the Putin regime's ready embrace of the cult of World War II. Instead, the reimaginings and renewed engagements with Russian avant-gardes, alongside with French, German, Italian, East European, Mexican, American, other international leftist art and theory, range from appropriative to critical. And of course, any forward-looking renewal of avant-garde energy necessarily includes important correctives, not least along lines of gender and sexuality. And I'll end with a few examples pointing in that direction. So the range of practices that I look at in my larger book project ranges from what I term the poetics of refusal, when the critique of literary institutions makes further publication impossible and transubstantiates poetry into activism, to very difficult philosophical poetry, modeled after Arkady Dragomoshenko and inspired by his exchanges with Lynn Haginian and the American academic language school poets. I'm particularly interested in the sites of publication and performance and in the reemergence of the avant-garde journal itself as a venue, an art object, a collective cause, and social network. Today's avant-garde journal, of course, has an active presence both off and online, and this interests me very much. The why of both of these presences, of both of these lives. Why online, why offline? While poets, however, test the limits of digital dissemination, they also insist on embodying their performances in ways that insist on the physical presence of the poet, at times in dangerous or illegal circumstances. So I'll give just a few vivid examples, I hope, of the variety of practices united by the translit constellation. The first is by Pavel Arseniev, the young and impossibly energetic, let's say, Breton figure of the group. One of his manifesto poems reads, Prodается Mayakovsky, and I'll show this in English and Russian, visible at least to the front row, but I'll read from it. So, Prodается Б.У. Маяковский на новой торговой площадке Рунета. Рекламные ссылки, добавить, послать ссылку другу, найдутся всех. Неограниченный трафик, чем заняться в свободное время, картинки, еще. As is typical of Arseniev's work, it is difficult immediately to identify Mayakovsky for sale as either a poem or a textual component of a composite artwork. It has been both. Mayakovsky for Sale was published as a poem in Translit, the journal, labeled from the cycle Ready Written. The corresponding video, however, has been published online and performs or explains its composition as a kind of found poetry fragment. So screen captured video, and I'll go back and show this image. The screen captured video shows the narrator cursor, presumably Arseniev himself, logging onto his email account and running a word search for Mayakovsky. The cursor hovers over but quickly skips past the content of an email exchange that comes up that mentions Mayakovsky. If the viewer pauses, rewinds, and rewatches the video a few times, it is possible to make sense of an exchange with a live journal blogger regarding Arseniev's ideas about poetry and the legacies of the avant-garde. But again, the poem skips past all that. The cursor instead heads for the advertisements and miscellaneous textual effluvia hovering at the edges of the screen, while the cursor selects the words and phrases that make up the poem or poem in quotation marks. Arseniev's digitized voice reads aloud the oddly evocative words. The video especially offers a glimpse into Arseniev's characteristic play across media, collaborative and performative poetics, and playful use of new technologies. The piece crosses very smoothly from individual to collective creation. It's shown to us as a poem by Arseniev, a single author. However, the video piece is by the Laboratory of Poetic Actions, a collaboration with Romanis Minkin and fellow poet Dina Gatina, among others. Poem and art object exist in offline and online formats, taking advantage in each instance of the particular context of their framing. Arseniev's most famous line of poetry, however, is one of the most recognized slogans of the 2011-2012 protest movements that, emblazoned across a banner, became a multiply remediated image of protest that I'm sure some of you at least have seen. Вы нас даже не представляете. The phrase is a pun based on two meanings of the verb представлять, to represent and to imagine, resulting in the twinned readings of the slogan, "You don't even represent us, you can't even imagine us." The line was photographed, emblazoned across a red banner, and reproduced in gallery format, becoming a stand-in for a particular moment in time, for the wit and youthful energy of the protest as a whole. I will also point out that the pun borders tantalizingly on the conceptual. You don't represent us politically, you can't even imagine us, perhaps generationally, but the words themselves are arguably fail to represent. However, this Magritte-like, this is not a pipe, language game, nevertheless means something very legible and tangible politically, pragmatically charged with its particular context. And it's this kind of strategy that I'm particularly interested in. And I'll give another example of Romanis Minkin reading the poem New Laws inside a circle of activists gathered in the summer of 2013 to protest the changing internet laws of the time. And again, to the extent that it's legible in Russian and English translation, and I'll read the Russian. Бывает, повстречаешь малолетку и сразу принимаешь строгий вид. Быстрее проходите мимо, детка, от вас половозрелостью фонит. А я законы новые читаю, и мне педофилию не пришьешь. Будь вы похожи трижды на Данаю, но возраст ваш несовершенен все ж. Etc. This performance, which I saw firsthand, transformed the energy of the otherwise listless crowd and made of the minor protest event an event with legs, if you will, especially through the ongoing digital dissemination of photos and videos of varying quality taken by the spectators. As Minkin actually prefaced his reading with the apology that his poems were about the wrong laws, noting that even he could not write fast enough at the time, and he has a graphomaniacal kind of practice, but not even he could write fast enough at the time to keep pace with changes in Russian legislation. His piece spoke instead to the still recent and then surprising to some laws targeting sexual deviancy, purportedly intended to protect the nation's youth from corrupting influences. The poem goes on, and the list of encounters that Minkin's lyric persona sternly avoids includes, of course, the underage girl, a skulking foreign agent, lesbians, and so forth. And I'll read the last two stanzas. Бывает, повстречаешь лесбиянок и сразу принимаешь строгий вид, будь трижды девицы без изъянов, от вас гаморы за версту фонит. А я законы новые читаю, гей-пропагандой у меня не прошибешь, в России пол себя не выбирают, родилась бабой, Babaj I Pamrioš. So there you have it. Legitimizing and bond-forming performances like this one, which again, the entire crowd was laughing, they were galvanized, they moved to the next location together, they had grown in number. Such performances require the poet to be there, to be poetly present at protests, at arrests, or other particularly politically charged events. But meanwhile, the digital dissemination via YouTube, via various online platforms, serves to document and share the work with a much wider community. In the new Poetics, then, offline and online worlds interact with and necessitate one another. Digital dissemination reflects the way that many actually read, share, and reference this material, whereas hard copies of the journals or chapbooks provide physical support, serving the purposes of collecting, of fundraising, of organizing events and discussions, archiving, signing, personalizing, and gift giving. And here I'll give one last example that was that took place much closer to the Brown campus. In February of 2015, the exhibition Spectres of Communism, Contemporary Russian Art opened simultaneously in 2 New York locations, the James Gallery at the CUNY Graduate Center and Eflux. Curated by Boris Groys, the show presented work by an array of contemporary Russian cultural figures, Katie Chukhrov, who I'll talk about today, the Что делать Collective, Anton Vidokul of Eflux, Pussy Riot. Groys's introductory essay and conceit made clear the premise of his curatorial selection. So taking inspiration from Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, Groys chose works that suggest, and I quote, communism continues to haunt Russia as well as the West. The conceptual work suggested by that haunting, however, only goes so far. Groys's conceit, with its characteristic emphasis on the transformation of life into art, suits some of the more formalist pieces. But as many reviewers noted, the most compelling work in the show looks forward as well as backwards. The pieces by Katie Chukhrov and Что делать especially, a group with which Chukhrov has also collaborated many times, in particular, grapple with the emergence of a new political subjectivity. In form as well as in content, Chukhrov's standout piece for Spectres of Communism reads as a kind of collective conjuring. The 2013 video, Love Machines, is based on Chukhrov's text, a verse drama structurally familiar to readers of her other poetic work. Chukhrov's own classically trained voice is also heard in unexpected bursts of song throughout the piece. But the video is shot and edited by others. The actors include other poets and artists well known in Russian leftist circles, Dina Gatina and Arseniy Zhelayev, the latter who was also featured independently in Groys's show, as well as the group Trupa Rupor and artistic director Semyon Filipov. So Love Machines is hardly then video art by Chukhrov, which is how some viewers of the exhibit initially, I would say, took it, so much as a collaborative co-production based on her written poetic work and made with her full participation. The content of this experimental verse drama is harder described, reading as an allegory that refuses to entirely signify its secondary meaning. The love machines in question are futuristic androids that appear to have been sent by someone to intervene in, to seduce and destroy, perhaps accelerate the lives of contemporary Muscovites. We view 3 stages of development simultaneously: a cow, the human, and the futurist machine, trapped together in a black box, I suppose not unlike this one, of a shared destiny and responsibility. The human remainder between animal and brutally seductive machine is unappealing. Yet the elite formation of futurist cyborgs who would eliminate all who cannot rise to their standards hardly maintain the moral high ground. The cyborgs wind down exercises of verbal shil, Alexei Kruchonik's most quoted line of avant-garde assault on Russian poetry from 1912, register as a mocking rebuke of one kind of avant-garde teleology. I'll show a slide from a different performance. There's a tautological whiff here of Groys's total art of Stalinism, which drew a direct and speedy line of descent from the Russian revolutionary avant-garde to the terrors of high Stalinism, and which may explain Groys's attraction to the piece. He's a big fan of all of Chukhrov's work. However, what Chukhrov explores, to my understanding, across her growing body of work, ultimately reads neither as totalitarian fear-mongering, it is, after all, committedly Marxist, nor as Soviet nostalgia, for it is profoundly critical of the failures of institutionalized socialism. So how then might we imagine an updated genealogy of Russian poetic avant-gardes? Nearly all of my subjects recognize a precursor in the conceptualist Dmitry Prigov, the ultimate father for a certain generation, if you will, who played the role of Russian poet as an extended provocative art performance. Prigov, in turn, locates his own experiments against the backdrop of the historical avant-gardes of the early 20th century. In Yevgeny Dobrenko's summary, discussing the genealogy of avant-garde art producing, Prigov distinguished its three ages: futurist constructivist, which was replaced by reaction against the mechanicalness and planned euphoria of the first by the Aberyuti, and only in the third age, this is in Prigov's estimation, the pop art and conceptualist stage, did the completion of the triad take place, the declaration of the untruthfulness of totalitarian ambitions. Building from Prigov's own brief history of soc art, we can add a fourth turn with the current generation of avant-garde poets and art producers, the paradoxical post-Soviet avant-garde. So why is Prigov so important to this overtly politicized group of contemporary poets and activists? Prigov brought Russian poetry into the space of contemporary art, specifically into the space of conceptualism and performance. More a poet in quotation marks than a poet, Prigov was an artist playing at great Russian poet in quotation marks, undermining the logocentric tendencies of Russian culture by taking it to an extreme. Slavoj Žižek has argued that over-identifying with the explicit power discourse, simply taking the power discourse at its own words, taking what it means and says, can be the most effective way of disturbing its smooth functioning. Anthropologist Alexei Yurchak somewhat similarly defines the effects of late Soviet parody or styob. Through such actions as his infamous, here pictured, performance of Tatyana's letter from Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, one of the most beloved moments in classical Russian literature, as a faux Buddhist mantra, Prigov disturbs the mystified function of the text precisely by exposing it as a sacred text. The graphomania of Prigov's enormous poetic output, in turn, which has been estimated at around 36,000 poems, in turn disrupts a certain privileged mode of reading, of exegesis, the close reading of the text for its hidden worth and difficulty, the privileged romantic mode united with the Soviet dissident preoccupation with Aesopian language that could slip subversive meanings past censors. Through its very bulk, Prigov's oeuvre forces us into a kind of distant reading avant la lettre, a reading that moves rapidly across many poems in search of meta-narratives instead. The change in strategy opens up new and unexpected possibilities for subsequent generations of Russian poets. We might compare, for example, Dmitry Golinka's rejection of the romantic and neo-romantic mode, as described in his manifesto essay, Applied Social Poetry. Golinka writes, "In order to give the poetic utterance an applied character, the poet with a radical gesture renounces the principle of aesthetic autonomy and also the use of the stereotypical romantic and modernist character of the poet prophet, demon, or eccentric. At the same time, he is compelled to free himself from the illusion of artistic independence and to admit his absolute dependence on antagonistic social codes and on a number of contradictory social voices." But for a contemporary cross-reference, I will mention that Golinka's essay is in turn inspired by the Polish artist Artur Żmijewski's manifesto Applied Social Art. Żmijewski in that essay argues that art can and must be used for the most diverse goals, as an instrument of receiving and disseminating knowledge, as a factory of cognitive procedures based on intuition and imagination, and as an occasion for learning and for political action. Galenka extends these possible uses of art to poetry, or at least to certain kinds of poetic practice. The translation, however, from Polish to Russian, from art to poetry, leaves remainders and plenty of room for anxiety, not least over the space of reception. A visual work of art, an installation, or a performance has the advantage of physically gathering together an audience and hence maintains a potential for interactivity and a fluid relationship between the performer and audience that is very different from the ways in which we typically consume poetry, or at least the ways in which we did in the 20th century. The younger generation of Russian performing poets tries to take strategic advantage of the space opened up by Prigov and by international artists. In an interview with me in July of 2014, Kirill Medvedev suggested the following line of dissent. And I quote my translation from our interview: "What was Prigov's accomplishment in large part? In that he learned each time with a mass of the most diverse methods to confront the reader with that serious, that modernist approach to art, to the poetic subject, to language in general. That is, you begin reading Prigov's work as verse, and then you understand that it is impossible to read it that way, as verse. But as that frame of mind persists inside of you, it creates a kind of conflict. And on that, it seems to me, it all rests. Each time some kind of neat creation of the unified logocentric subject falls apart, and it falls apart namely from some impulse from below, as it were, from the point of view of some kind of direct and an unmediated, an immediate and unpoetic discourse. And that, it seems to me, someone like Roma, he means Romanes Minkin, has glimpsed a kind of potential for a new democratic approach in Prigov's poetics. And he decided to develop it in a more engaged direction. For example, Asminkin uses the line from Prigov as the epigraph to On the Method, an essay describing his own poetic practice. The line is, "I think that the most democratic literature is not one that is comprehensible to everyone, but one that pays attention to all conventional linguistic gesture." In the context of Asminkin's prose, however, the emphasis on democratic literature reads completely differently than in Prigov's use. It implies concrete political goals. Now, nearly all of these practices that I explore and study repoliticized and even tentatively re-romanticized, albeit with accompanying irony, the figure of the poet. Kirill Medvedev speaks of a weak heroism necessary in a political moment when cultural figures feel called to social responsibility and even to heroic action, while remaining deeply ambivalent about and profoundly suspicious of the heroic posture of the Russian poet. This image, or set of images, for example, depicts Medvedev with other members of his protest rock group Arkady Kots singing The Walls, Stanley, originally Louis Locke's 1968 Catalan protest song L'Estasa, remade into More, the anthem of Polish solidarity in the 1980s, now in Medvedev's Russian translation. And they're performing inside an Avtozak police van when they were arrested protesting outside of the courtroom at the Pussy Riot trial. Clearly recording and disseminating this impromptu music video of them continuing to sing in the armored vehicle, which is one of several versions available on YouTube, suggests a conscious utilization of the still recently dismantled cultural capital of the poet in Russian society. And I'll just show a recent similar pairing from that period from Romanes Minkin, again, a song themed around the Pussy Riot moment. So a brief word on methods, and then I will start pulling towards a conclusion. I believe that the study of such forms also affords us an opportunity to reimagine and occupy a very different space in Slavic literary studies as a field. In the place of Cold War dichotomies, we might foreground instead transnational Russian-American exchanges and political and cultural solidarities. The newest and most networked Russian avant-garde complicates our frameworks of study through the shock of synchrony between producing and consuming international publics. So The canonization of Kirill Medvedev, for example, seems to have been taking place in real time. In the past 5, 6, 7 years, international audiences began catching on to a voice familiar to Moscow literary circles since the early 2000s. For non-Russian readers, the breakthrough coincided with the first volume of his work in English translation, It's No Good, published in December of 2012 through the efforts of Keith Gesson and Matvey Yankelevich at the Brooklyn-based N+1 and Ugly Duckling Press. Medvedev's essays on politics and aesthetics have since made their way into such publications as the New Left Review, The Guardian, the London Review of Books. Interviews and reviews have appeared in The Independent, The Nation, The New Inquiry, The Boston Review, The Chicago Review, The Paris Review, The Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, to name a few. In Bomb magazine, Chris Cummings points to the striking fact that, and I quote, a Marxist activist and free verse poet who writes only for his own blog should get as much attention in America as Medvedev has, including a favorable review last week in that mouthpiece of socialism and experimental poetry in the New York Times. No doubt, this reflects the tireless publicity work of his publisher N+1. But there's more to it. Many people in America are disgusted by our politics and depressed by our literary culture, and Medvedev's central subject is the miserable marriage of these two. And his own life and his Russianness give his opinions a legitimacy on these subjects that American writers lack. He has behind him a tradition of Russian artists who combine political and aesthetic radicalism, something American writers don't really have. So that's Cummings speaking, and the problems with this exotic, alleged Russian authenticity are too close to the surface to need much pointing out. But again, there's something interesting there for us to analyze in the discourse and rhetoric. My own methods range from textual analysis to interviews and readings of cultural happenings and events that have been based on years of recurring field work, hours of conversation, translation, and collaboration, most importantly. I try to highlight the confusing collapse of some of these distinct approaches when working with contemporary material in a globally networked era, something I'm fascinated by. I will say increasingly that my methods start to creep into my subject because it seems to me part of the problem of our contemporary moment and cultural studies in our contemporary moment. And I'll give an image from Facebook. So, what degree of distance can be posited between Russian aesthetic practice and American, for example, academia, given ongoing dialogues as well as constant fears of tokenization or anachronism on both sides? Contemporary technologies enhance global communities' awareness of each other in dramatic and unprecedented ways, influencing aesthetical and critical practices. I consider these paradoxes an integral part of the story. The sudden shock of synchrony between Russian and American intellectuals, not to use the fraught term intelligentsia, is at once disenchanting, and productive for both communities. The poets whose work I analyze in turn both suggest and push back against critical frames as they themselves study, translate, and publish essays on critical theory in real time, in some cases extremely recent critical theory, alongside original poetry. So in conclusion, what kind of avant-garde legacy is this? It is a pulse beating strongly or weakly throughout the last century and more, offering up a history of unrealized possibilities and interrupted projects. The poets of Translit read earlier Russian avant-gardes through the lenses of decades of international Marxist theory, which is now part of the world culture that post-Soviet Russian writers can reclaim. And I'll show this great slide from St. Petersburg, a procession with a black square from a few years ago. Keith Gesson, in his introductory essay on Medvedev, writes, what is it that this generation of Russian newcomers sees that the previous generation, the generation of the fathers, if you will, seems to have failed to understand, in their estimation at least, and responds that it's the very thing they thought they knew best of all, Marxism. Not the Soviet teachings of Karl Marx, but the many intellectual heirs of Marx in the West in the post-war era. This is the Frankfurt School and Sartre and the Situationist International and Pierre Bourdieu and the Anglo-American thinkers around the New Left Review, but also such non-aligned thinkers as Barthes, Foucault, and Baudrillard. Of course, it's not that these figures were entirely unknown in the Soviet Union, but they seem to be only partly known. And again, now paradoxically are part of the world culture explosion that younger generations see themselves as inheriting. Again, in interview, Kirill Medvedev corroborates that reading. Why doesn't Russia have a normal literary criticism, he asks. Because all the major critical theories of the West in the 20th century passed in one way or another through Marxism. Until the same happens in Russia, there won't be any criticism at all, not of poetry, not of the authorities. And I'll end with a quote of his from a more recent interview. The goal of Russian art today must be to find new ways of interacting with politics, pushing off in part from the achievements of our 1920s avant-garde and in part from the experience of the West in the 20th century, which was in many ways ignored or marginalized in the USSR. I don't believe that Russian history and culture have a special messianic mission, but I do know that from time to time, the situation in Russia unfolds in such a way that it gives rise to a cultural political leap, allowing us to overtake the West and present something genuinely new, or else to give our very specific, but at the same time universal, answer to a problem that the West has been wrestling with. That's what happened with the political form of the Soviets that came out of 1905 and were later adopted by many revolutionary and social movements across the world. The same thing happened with the Russian avant-garde. It is possible that we're experiencing a similar situation right now. Thank you. And I would be delighted to hear questions, comments, thoughts, and response. Yes, thank you. Kostya.
What I'm thinking, if we try to put it in the context, a historical Russian context, and I wonder if you agree with me, what is fascinating both for Russians and to the West is that when we have some kind of rather organic figure which responds to the rather concrete Russian situation, and I'm thinking the 19th century when I think about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, now we view them as sort of kind of the figures of the canon, but they were actual rebels.
Right.
Both, Dostoevsky ended up being kind of arrested first and in prison and so on. Then he became kind of conservative. But the same thing with Tolstoy. Tolstoy was like, shaking the cage of Tsarism, but at the same time, they were part of the culture. So once they got translated into the West, they acquired totally different aura. Like, Dostoevsky is read differently from how Russians read it. Russians would be fascinated, say, with brothers in the West, his notes from underground, to Western imagination. Tolstoy was behind all this, new fancy theories from vegetarianism to prison reform. While in Russia, he was viewed as maybe as a kind of moral teacher. So I think it's kind of a very interesting thing which happened in the 19th century. Maybe it's the same thing in Russia. They have to respond to this, I would say, bastardization of Marxism, which Soviet Union is. So basically, they created a bastard version of leftism and Marxism. Right. So these guys are trying kind of to resurrect it, and I think they will be rather timely for the West, because West still kind of either deals maybe with some theoreticians which are way too far, or with some Cold War warriors who just basically say, "Well, look at Soviet Union, communism is out." So I think it's a very interesting paradox of organically grown figure, which sort of which respond to something inside the country and sort of outside, and these guys might fit in because they kind of need.
So I 100% agree with that. Another figure that immediately comes to mind, and one that has been very much revived in popular contemporary imagination, is Chernyshevsky. And Chernyshevsky is a feminist thinker, particularly. So I think of the work of someone like Lyukya Pershina, an artist who has a project called the Theater of Utopian Clothing, playing with seamstress collective, et cetera, that sees itself as drawing on 19th century Russian utopian roots and trying to revive that in a 21st century context. So 100%. And again, in terms of returning to my opening question of what is it that post-institutionalized socialism, post-institutionalized socialist artists can tell us about socialism? What can they say that is different than what is being done by N+1 and Ugly Duckling Press in Brooklyn? What makes these figures different than, let's say, their Brooklyn counterparts? Or Barcelona is a different story. Again, each location has its own complexities. It's that figures, including someone like Kirill Medvedev, generationally, remembers a Soviet childhood. So they're drawing on a particular experience, something that they can compare to the dramatic cultural or generational, dramatic trauma of their own generation, which is not fear of the gulag, but which is privatization and what they actually saw, which is however many tens, hundreds, and thousands of, for example, babushki going missing, dying of starvation or being murdered overnight, and nobody noticing. This is their big generational trauma, is the transition to capitalism. And again, they have something they can both compare it to, and legacies of thought, complex interactions of aesthetics and politics in relating, that they can draw on as a way of imagining, reimagining, trying to portray their own experiences, which is incredibly culturally rich, and which, again, all complexities aside, does not exist in Brooklyn. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about your idea of like this neo-poetics? Because you were talking earlier about how before the idea of communication with like painting, whether or with it, I don't remember what was you had like two other examples, but it was like painting, so the visual, like installations, actions versus like normative idea of poetry. Because do you see that as having completely collapsed at this point, where, I mean, even with the conceptualists, the idea of like the different arts were not, I mean, they were not like, this is this art, this is this, this is like, this is poetry, this is painting, this is photography. It was all like intertwined. Do you see that as having just like completely collapsed and just being a newly transformed space, or like?
Excellent question, and I'll try to answer it on a couple different levels. And I'm showing here the Asminkin performing poetry as backdrop. So I'm interested in various moments where the distinctions between genres and media fall apart. Again, if we're thinking of a European context, situationist, etc., 68 moment, moments when it becomes very hard to tell who's a poet, who's a composer, who's a visual artist. At the same time that visual artists might be producing primarily words on canvas, poets are trying to give a different kind of heft and materiality to words by also creating installations or through performance using the voice itself as a way of adding materiality, physicality to words. So interesting that you have these moments of attack from both sides, and absolutely now seems to be one of those moments, even just simply experimentally, formally speaking. Again, what I'm highly interested in is, in the Russian context, what happens at the crossover of poetry and performance. Why do these people even say that they are poets, is one question that we should be asking. Why not simply be artists, which might be a more useful position or identity to occupy in, let's say, an American context? Well, again, it's because of this complex capital and tradition, cultural capital behind poetry. And thinking of poetry as a particularly politically charged and still productive venue of experimentation, again, in the Russian context. On the one hand, at the same time as they want to take advantage of the different kinds of interactions and possibilities that performance and more immediate interactions offer. So they are not content to be only read, although all of them have published books of poetry and do publish poetry that is labeled poetry or in poetry journals or comes out in poetry series. At the same time, they want to have some different kind of interaction with their audience that usually results in or ends in some kind of political action. Again, I can give an example from the contemporary art sphere of what this can look like. A Russian context, the same artist that I mentioned, Glukля Pershina. I'm thinking about writing an article about her next, which is why she's so fresh in my mind. But to give a different example that's similar to what this one that I talked about offers, Glukля Pershina will have a theater event in a space not unlike this one. An audience plant will suddenly scream, "The police are coming, we all have to leave." Everybody, one person leaves, another person gets up and leaves, and suddenly everybody finds themselves trooping out in a panic, even though it's unclear what any of us were doing wrong and why it's a problem the police are coming. As you walk out, someone hands you a picket, a placard, something to carry that usually has some kind of nonsense, experimental, conceptualist, either words or object on it. So again, you find yourself participating in a political protest where it's not clear what it is that you're protesting, marching along with everybody. Bystanders join you because they're curious what's going on. Somebody might be carrying something like the Malevich Black Square. Somebody might have lines of Prigov, etc. Clearly, this is a way of galvanizing and toying with the political potential of gathering in a place. This is why theater has always been dangerous and is one of the first things that you censor, because people are gathered together and they can do something next. And again, it's trying to occupy this kind of space, take that kind of radical potential, merging it with the potential and legacies of Russian avant-garde poetics that I think is central to the formal practices of many of these poets.
That sounds very, the picture sounds very similar to Rodina. It's like this idea of there's a Petersburg group, it's like that's but like the nonsense picketing, that you can't be stopped from picketing.
Right. Right, are you picketing, right? You're not protesting anything at all. Or the various quiet protests, holding a blank banner that doesn't say anything, etc. No, absolutely. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, thank you.
I wanted to make a comment about Mayakovsky. Продается Маяковский. So
Yeah.
it says продается Mayakovsky, but it says продается БУ Mayakovsky. So
Abused Mayakovsky, exactly.
so that's very important because Alexander Skidan visited this department many years ago,
Yeah.
and I went and heard his talk. And then I approached him and I said, "What do you think of Akhmatov and Tsvetaeva?" I said that in Russian because we share the same language. And he said, "I don't care for them." So this is exactly the same. You know, these people are trying to depose of, the old classics, quote unquote, which is ironic because Mayakovsky was trying to depose of Pushkin. So it's, it's continuing that tradition. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll say that I don't, in that particular instance, I don't believe Skidan at all, that he doesn't care at all for the modernist legacy. I think he cares very, very much. And again, maybe of this larger constellation, he might be the example who's closest to something resembling, let's say, an Acmeist tradition. But again, this is part of the performance. The I don't care at all, I am an international thinker, I am a Marxist philosopher, is part of what they perform at the same time that they're absolutely drawing on these local traditions. With this, I think, rather than a gesture of refusal entirely, the way that I read it, and again, especially a figure like Mayakovsky, who is so central both politically and aesthetically to nearly all the members of this group, they are trying to do away with one fossilized, reified, used Mayakovsky in order to revive their own, which is a kind of precursor that absolutely belongs in their leftist canon. Akhmatova, perhaps more difficult to absorb. Tsvetaeva, many of them absorb very readily. So again, depends to some extent on the figure, and I always question, like you, the rejection, think that it is both performative and appropriative, as well as, of course, raising the question of who's Mayakovsky, the same as who's Pushkin. But excellent, thank you. Yes?
Do you think these poets' kind of appropriation into the mainstream affects their kind of cultural capital at the grassroots level, or is it enhanced by that?
Yeah. Again, marvelous, marvelous question, and one that comes up a great deal, sometimes phrased as the moment that someone like Kirill Medvedev, who sees himself as countercultural, becomes the darling of the New York Times, or Brown and Yale, all is lost. Any kind of grassroots authenticity is lost. And I will repeat something that I said earlier today, speaking with some of you, which is that many of these figures struggle and push back against models of authenticity and say this isn't the right approach. So again, people have also said, how Russian is someone like Kirill Medvedev if he's in fact inspired by Walt Whitman or Bukowski or someone like this? Is he not in fact basically translating American free verse poetry into Russian and hence not really very Russian? This also gets levied against Katy Chukhrov all the time, some of the others a little bit less. But many of them would respond by saying that their poetics is a poetics against Russian nationalism, so that they're really not interested in performing authenticity, and they're precisely interested in disrupting something that seems like a pure national tradition on the one hand. Also, in terms of these competing dichotomized publics and producers, this is something else that they're uncomfortable with. That the minute that we decide that there's an elite that is disqualified by being elite, by virtue of being elite, that any degree of education immediately puts you in line with corporations and makes you the enemy, that we've fallen into a terrible mistake, into a trap and an impossible way forward. That said, I will say that there are different strategies for navigating this. Or rather that there's strategies for navigating the challenges that come up, which are no way easy and facile, not so easily resolved as I might have just suggested, that their strategies are really very diverse. So someone like Alexander Skidan rests on unapologetically the difficulty of his formal strategies, of his intellectual references and what he is trying to do. And his response might be something like, you cannot describe a culturally, socioeconomically, politically, etc., complex situation in simple language. And so I'm simply describing it the only way that it must be described. Whereas someone like Kirill Medvedev, I think very much worries about accessibility and accessibility to different audiences, and in part has evolved different practices, so poetry published in certain venues, but also protest rock performances that try to reach multiple publics. So there's a certain kind of material that Kirill Medvedev might present at an international academic conference that he will go to and participate in, and something similar, but slightly different or modified when he is performing at an event trying to galvanize independent union organizing.
So being just a dynamic figure that can, change their face according to the situation, and maintaining their kind of original grassroots activities.
Mm-hmm. And I would say by virtue of demonstrating the ease with which it can be done, trying to show the lie of thinking of these as necessarily distinct groups in the first place. That's an idealistic response, but an apologetically idealistic one.
Any other questions from the audience? But in that case, let's thank again.
Thank you. Thank you. Marvelous questions and a pleasure to be here. Thank you.